Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we're going to be answering a question that came up just today. Someone sent me an email, and it's going to be a fun one. I love going into this stuff. And the question is, how many mics do you really need to record drums, record live acoustic drums in a room? Right. How many mics do you need? And I'm going to give you the answer right now. This is the TLDR version. I guess that's TLDL, too long, didn't listen. The TLDL, too long, didn't listen version is 1. You need 1 microphone to record drums properly. That's it. That said, you can use a lot more than 1. You can use 16 or more. And I want to give you a framework for thinking through how many drum mics you might want to use for a drum recording session. That's going to be one of my big goals for you today. And you can get a great drum sound with just 1 microphone, with just 2 microphones, with 3, with 4, with 16, with 18. And I'll get into some principles here. But first, I want to read the question that inspired this. It came in from a guy named David. David is actually a very good drummer, and a friend of mine worked with him in projects in the past. And he writes, "Hey, Justin, I'm curious about your opinion on something, if you have a moment. My current home setup," he's recording a lot more at home now for obvious reasons I don't have to explain in summer of 2020. "My home setup is a UA Apollo 4X. For tracking drums, which I want to be able to do remotely for clients, I have 4 inputs, which gives me overhead, left and right, snare, and kick. While I love the sounds that I get now, small room with really nice reflections, I wonder if I'm short 1 input for hi-hat," he says. "I'm thinking of situations where a more modern sound is desired, or the hi-hat is a more prominent sound in the mix. But in both of these scenarios, where sacrificing the kick and snare isn't an option, I'm trying to figure out what to do. I could add another piece of Apollo hardware," he writes, "to expand the inputs," which would also expand DSP in this case. "But in your experience and knowledge of EQ, drum miking, etc., is a reasonable workaround to just use brighter hi-hats or hi-hats that have more transient?" And he goes on to list a few different models of hi-hats, and I could geek out about drum hardware just like I could geek out about guitar hardware, because I'm a geek of all things audio, not just microphones and plugins and stuff. So I could geek there, but I'm not going to do that for you guys, get into the hardware geeking. He asks, wondering if you'd encountered this kind of issue, and ultimately, what's the best approach? "My goal is to offer great drum sounds in different genres to clients, but also freedom to the artist and mix engineer to manipulate them to their desired level of satisfaction. Any advice or links to a deeper dive would be great if you have a moment." This is that deeper dive, and I think we can cover a lot of ground here. I'm going to answer David's question. I'm also going to answer similar questions that I think you might have in your own life. Before I answer this question, what do I have to do? I have to make the simple plea that you please consider smashing the like button if you're on the YouTube version of this podcast. I'll wait. Thanks so much. That's all I needed was a gentle tap of the like button. If you are on the audio-only version of this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review, particularly on Apple Podcasts, where it really helps the algorithm gods, as does your likes and comments on the YouTube. It really helps get this stuff out there. Also, the briefest of shout-outs to our sponsors, you, because you smashed the like button. The last little shout-out is to Sound Toys, makers of some of my favorite creative mixing effects, who are sponsoring this episode of the podcast. Also, Steinberg, making some very cool software programs like the DAWs, Cubase, and Nuendo, like Wavelab, like Dorico, the music notation software. Awesome stuff. Check those guys out. Now let's dive into this week's question. How many mics? I said in the beginning, you only need 1 mic to record drums well. And I know one guy who I've interviewed on numerous occasions. I've probably interviewed him at least 3 times. He runs one of my favorite record labels in the history of recorded music, and that is Gabe Roth of Daptone Records. If you don't know Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings, you should. If you never had the opportunity to see him live, my goodness, I hope live performance is coming back as a thing. Any of the Daptone artists you should see live. Fantastic. I was a big fan of Sharon Jones, Budos Band, Charles Bradley, etc., but really kind of retro sounding stuff, like, think Motown meets James Brown, but like even more amped up and awesome. I mean, fantastic stuff. And he always liked to record drums with 1 mic. And his big thing was finding like the one place that you put that 1 mic around the kit, and then making sure you have a good balance just from placing that 1 mic. And a big part of this is the drummer being so good that they are balancing themselves. So that is totally possible. And a lot of old school recordings that still sound great today have been recorded with one mic on drums. So it's totally possible. When I started my 4-track cassette days, when I was 12 years old, my father bought himself a 4-track to record his own, amateur dabblings in music. He couldn't program the VCR, much less figure out how to use a 4-track, so I inherited the 4-track, and I ended up using it. And in my bands, when I was a teenager, I had 2 microphones. So we would put all of our guitar amps and like the bass amp around one microphone, and then we put one microphone on the drum kit, get a good balance between all of that stuff, and then you'd have to listen back and say, you're playing the cymbals too loud, or you should play the snare louder, and then you'd adjust, and then it's like we had 2 channels left. Awesome. So yes, it is possible to get good sounds, and not just good sounds, but great sounds in the case of Daptone and so many old records, off of one mic. But that's not necessarily going to satisfy all of us, and it's not necessarily going to be appropriate for all genres. So 4 inputs. I mean, that's a good place to start. But listen to what David said in his email. He's assuming that he needs overhead left and right, kick and snare. And then he's wondering, do I need an extra channel for hi-hat? Well, I want to answer the hi-hat question first and foremost. The biggest thing that I've noticed in hi-hat, particularly with rock bands, pop musicians, and a lot of new drummers, the problem is not that the hi-hat is too quiet. Usually the problem is that hi-hat is too loud, and sometimes it's like louder than the snare drum in your snare mic, and that's a big problem that a lot of people run into. With David, that might not be an issue because he's a really good drummer. He can balance himself. But a lot of new drummers and a lot of new bands, if you're getting into this for the first time and you only have a limited number of inputs, a lot of new drummers are going to have the problem of laying into the hi-hat too hard, laying into the cymbals too hard compared to their drums. And they haven't yet learned that they can make their drums sound bigger and louder and more powerful, not just by hitting them harder, but by actually lightening up on how hard they're hitting the cymbals. And that's a big breakthrough. But it's tricky. New drummers are often tense, they're really tight, they want things to sound powerful, so they hit everything hard. But when they hit everything hard, sometimes those cymbals overwhelm the sound of the drums. So what I actually did a lot in my days where I was mostly recording was, especially with new artists, new bands, young drummers, I like to do a hi-hat mic. So I could feed a good amount of hi-hat into the drummer's headphones so the drummer wouldn't hit the hi-hat too hard. So my favorite reason for adding on an extra hi-hat mic is to make the hi-hat quieter by feeding that into the drummer's headphones and encouraging them to hit the hi-hat less hard that way. That's why I like to give drummers, if I can, as much overhead mic as I can in their headphones. And if they're not hearing enough kick and snare, I'm like, well, I'm going to turn up the whole thing. Now back off on how loud you're hearing the cymbals, and you hear the kick and snare louder. I'm going to turn up the whole thing. That can be a losing battle. Sometimes you do need to give them more kick and snare. You don't want to like play a game and be like this taskmaster where you're not giving them any kick and snare and you're saying, do it yourself, you play the drums better, because you can only steer people so far. You can only pull them so far beyond their comfort zone. So you want to support them. You want to give them a good sound. So in their headphones, give them kick and snare, but maybe also give them a hi-hat and maybe make sure you're giving them a significant amount of overheads so they're not overbashing cymbals. So my answer to David here is that I think you can get good, loud hi-hats by balancing yourself. But if you only had 4 channels to work with and you wanted to add on a hi-hat mic, there are other approaches. You do not necessarily need stereo left and right overheads, kick and snare. First of all, you can record drums with a mono overhead, kick and snare. And for some genres, that's appropriate. Again, for kind of more retro sounds, and even sometimes for modern sounds. I had some friends who worked with a great Nigel Godrich, who did so much of the Radiohead stuff. And when he came into their studio, he used a single U67 overhead, a single mic inside the kick drum, and that was it. And that, like, he got his main sound off of those 2 mics on this project. And it gave a great mono picture of the drums. And you can do that kind of thing. And then you can add on spot mics on those things you want to accent. Hey, this is a hi-hat driven song. Let's add on a hi-hat mic. you have the more channels. Another approach, if you want things to sound stereo, but you want to conserve on channels, is Glyn-Johns, the Glyn-Johns technique. This is a mic technique where one of your overhead mics points directly down at your snare drum, and the other one kind of points across your tom. If you want to hear and see the Glyn-Johns technique in action, I have a very popular drum miking video out there where you can see me go through a whole bunch of different overhead miking techniques. And the most popular one, at least the one that got the most comments, was the Glyn-Johns technique, because it sounded so much different than all the other microphone choices that we tried. It sounded different than XY. It sounded different than Space Pair. It sounded different than one of my favorites, ORTF. But Glyn-Johns, because you have that overhead mic pointing right down at the center of the snare, man, it just like brings that snare to life, and you really don't need a separate snare mic with the Glyn-Johns technique. So that opens up a channel for you to point at some item that you want featured, whether it's the hi-hat or a tambourine or a ride cymbal. So that's a cool approach. Glyn-Johns still get stereo, don't need a dedicated snare mic. So now you have Glyn-Johns overhead snare, Glyn-Johns overhead tom, you pan those out, and then you add on a kick mic, and then maybe you add on your hi-hat or other incidental mic. And you can cover a lot with just one mic on drums, with just two mics on drums, overhead that's directly over the snare and kick, with just three mics on drums, maybe in a Glyn-John style, or if it's in a jazz setting with a spaced pair and then maybe a supplemental kick mic, or four mics. But part of Dave's question here, and maybe this is a question that's important to you, he says, my goal is to offer great drum sounds in different genres, but also freedom to the artist and mix engineer to manipulate them to their desired level of satisfaction. If you're looking for freedom and manipulatability, then the big thing is multi-mic techniques. A lot of mics. How many mics? Well, I'll give you a sense for how I often liked to mic drums when I was miking drums, and I wasn't going to be the one mixing it, and you're trying to get the overall multi-mic'd drum kit that people can do whatever they want with later. First, I'm going to offer the caveat, and a very good caveat that's offered by a guy like Gabe Roth of Daptone, who is audacious enough to say, why do I need 20 mics? I can have one mic. You just put it in the right place, listen to what it sounds like, give feedback to the drummer. Hey, you're hitting the hi-hat too loud. Can you hit the snare louder? Hey, maybe we should move it a little bit so we get a little bit more ride cymbal. You know, hey, we want a more distant sound. Let's move the mic back. There is a tremendous validity to that approach of getting things right at the source. And rather than getting this, hey, overall, do whatever you want with a drum picture. No, say we know what everything is supposed to sound like. In this mix, we're going for the funk feel. We're going for the 60s mod rock feel, whatever it is, and just get that drum sound going in. But that said, the reality is that in a lot of cases, a lot of people are going to want to do multi-miking. I'm going to give you my recipe for what you could do with 8 channels, because that's a number of channels that a lot of people will land on. Then I'll give you my recipe for what you might do with 10 channels of drums, because it's pretty easy to get 2-channel, additional. And then I'll give you my recipe for 16 and more mics. Here we go. Are you ready for it? If you have 8 channels, man, what would I do? Well, you got to have, we're probably doing stereo overheads. We're probably talking about that. I probably want a kick in mic and a kick out mic. And I probably want what's called a front of kit mic. That is a mic that is kind of far out from the kit, maybe a little while back. It's kind of a room mic that's still fairly direct. It's supposed to capture the whole kit from the front. And then maybe there is Tom 1 and Tom 2, we're up to 7. And then maybe there is a hi-hat mic. And my purpose for that hi-hat mic is in many cases not to make the hi-hat louder, but to make it quieter. And to make it quieter by feeding more hi-hat into the drummer's headphones if he or she is a real cymbal basher. Oh man, I'm listening to myself here and realizing I didn't make room for a snare mic in those 8 channels, and that's super essential in a multi-mic setup. So a quick edit here to say that I'd have to lose one of those channels to put in a standard top of snare microphone. I mean, what would we get rid of? It would probably be either the outside kick mic or that front of kit mic, or the hi-hat mic to fit in a snare. So one of those has to go, and it depends on what you need. Do you need a really detailed, close-sounding hi-hat, or the ability to get some hi-hat into your drummer's headphones? Or do you need a front of kit mic, a kind of room mic that's a couple feet back to several feet back, picking up the overall picture of the drum kit? Or do you need that outside kick drum mic that's just adding a little bit of extra dimensionality to the kick drum? Which one of those is most essential, least essential, that you could lose to insert that snare mic? But this is the tricky, funny thing with, multi-mic techniques. As soon as you start down this road of, let's mic things discreetly, then there's almost no end to how many mics you can end up putting on things. And we're going to get into that right about now. Okay, that's probably how I'd approach 8. I understand that you can be thrown for a loop if the drummer has more than 2 toms. And then you're going to have to sacrifice one of those items if you want close mics on all of the toms. But then if we have 10 channels, we could do a couple of things. One, if we have more toms, we could add on additional tom mics. Or thing number 2 we can do is add on stereo rooms. And that can be a lot of fun. These might be further back than a front of kit mic. A front of kit mic might be fairly close to the kick drum. It's trying to get kick drum and snare overall picture. And it hopefully is giving you the kind of sound where you could just use that one mic and it's a great balance. Whereas a stereo room, they might be further back, significantly further back, almost to the point where there's maybe a slight feeling of a little bit of delay or ambience. If you want to go really crazy, you want to have things be super ambient, you can turn those room mics the wrong way. So they're pointing away from the kit, just catching reflections off the wall. One of my favorite things to do with room mics is to use what are called Gobos. These would be movable sound baffles. Amazing thing if you're in a large room, you can put Gobos, movable sound baffles, around a drummer. So you actually get a really tight, dry, direct sound. And you can make a big room sound super small, super tight, super dry by putting Gobos around the drummer. But here's the cool thing. Now, when you put your room mics outside of those Gobos, they're getting almost none of the direct sound for the drums, and they're getting mostly just the ambience from the drums. Man, that can make a room sound huge. So even if you're in a small room, that can be a fun thing to do. You could have a drummer, and then in front of that drum kit, you could have a gobo, a sound barrier, and then beyond that sound barrier, you have a microphone. And now that microphone is not picking up as much direct sound from the drums. It's just picking up mostly the reflections from the walls. And that is how you can cheat to make a small room sound larger. So Gobos can both make things sound tighter and drier on drums, but they can also make things sound bigger than they are by cutting off direct sound from room mics and ambient mics. So I've given you my recipe for 10. At any point, I might want to evict one of those mics because my next favorite mic to load in just a little bit might be an under snare microphone. An under snare microphone is going to pick up the rattles from underneath the snare drum. And that can be a fun thing to have. You usually just mix in a tiny little bit of it. You probably are going to need to reverse the phase on it. Let's be serious. If you're recording drums with any more than one mic, like as soon as you're recording with 2 mics or more, you're going to want to be careful with phase, and you're going to want to try flipping polarity on things to see if they sound better one way or another. But that would be the next possible thing to add, is that under snare mic. And then after that, the next things I would think about are under tom mics, which, if you have a direct mic on tom, it really helps on the top. It really helps bring out some more attack and impact, and can make the toms jump out at you more if that's something that you want. The toms can sound as upfront and as direct as your snare and kick if you have a top mic on them. But if you have a bottom mic on your toms, then all of a sudden you're getting more resonance, more sustain, and it's a whole nother world, and you really hear the whole tone of the drum and the shelly sound. And top and bottom mics on toms can be cool. And the more of these channels we're adding in, the more of like a modern drum sound we're getting. But that said, these kinds of modern drum sounds, I don't know how modern they are anymore, because to be honest, a lot of the references my clients give me sound like they have fairly minimal mic'd drums these days. Like the coolest records that my clients send me as mastering references these days usually don't have this kind of ornate 18-channel mic setup feel anymore. And oftentimes they have a feel that feels tailored and minimal, and these drums could have been recorded with two mics, just like Nigel Godrich was doing at my friend's studio when he went to visit. That stuff is still totally valid. And putting up 18 mics, these are things that give you more potential possibilities or ways to manipulate things. But they're not necessarily the thing that gives you the custom tailored answer to the song. What gives you a custom tailored answer to the song is going minimalist and making choices upon listening, rather than putting up a whole bunch of mics and then having someone else solve that puzzle later. So even if you are going to go for this multi-mic'd approach, I'd still recommend to you, think about doing a multi-mic approach in the same way that you would do it with one mic, in that you want to commit to your sounds right now, so that ideally, if someone brings up all of the faders to the drum kit to 0, you have a great drum balance. So that the person who's going to be mixing it or whatever doesn't need to start moving faders to get balances sounding good. Ideally, you're printing this stuff in a way into your DAW where with all the faders at 0, it sounds like a killer drum balance and you don't need to do much else. And that's even more possible today in the age of digital than it would have been in the past. Because in the age of tape machines, if you only want a tiny bit of an under snare mic, man, you'd have to, if you wanted to print that really quietly, you'd have a lot of noise on that channel. So it wouldn't really make sense to print something really quietly if you only want a little bit of it in the mix, because the noise on that channel might end up being as hot as the instrument itself. But with 24-bit recording these days, man, you can print really quiet to tracks and not run into noise or degradation issues. You don't have to use all the bits. That's kind of a bit of a myth and a misnomer in certain ways. So you can print things that are supposed to be quiet. You can print things that are supposed to be loud, relatively loud. So I'd encourage you to think about a multi-mic technique in that way. But a multi-mic technique gives you the ability to do things like add on bottom tom mics, which gives toms a totally different sound that you're not going to achieve with one microphone, or you're not going to achieve with, a single overhead or just top mics on the toms. It's going to allow you to do things like put a spot mic on that hi-hat, which does give the hi-hat a different character, a more direct character, and potentially allows your drummer to play that hi-hat even more quietly, which allows it to not bleed into the other drums. So that when you add a whole bunch of compression and EQ to things, you're not bringing up the hi-hat by accident when you're adding compression and EQ. And the same thing could happen with a ride cymbal. If you wanted to keep on going and add more things, you could put a spot mic on your ride cymbal. And there are certain types of drummers and genres where you might have a spot mic on each cymbal. Like, it's not unheard of in certain styles of recording. Is it necessary? No. Is it desirable for certain fusion-y genres that are going to want to feature each of these elements coming in such a discrete way where they almost sounded like they were recorded separately? Yeah, that's a potential way to go. That said, another option is you could record some of your drums in multiple passes. And there's a story about a band doing just that. I believe it was Queens of the Stone Age, when Dave Grohl was drumming for them. I'm pretty sure it was a story about them where they had him record just the drums in one pass and just the cymbals in another pass. You could do that in your studio. And then you have drums where you can compress and EQ them like crazy and you don't worry about the cymbals coming up. This is a point that's so important. I wish I brought it up even earlier on. The idea that one of the reasons it's good to have drummers lay back on cymbals, and a good potential reason to have mics on cymbals and feed that a lot to the drummer's headphones, is if you're able to keep the volume of the cymbals down in the recording, you're able to amp up things like a live recorded kick and snare with compression, with EQ, with limiting, without bringing up a whole weird mess of now compressed, limited, EQ'd, harsh sounding cymbals. But a potential way around this is to record in 2 steps, drums only and cymbals only. That might be a little bit extreme, but it might make sense for some of you. All right, I think it's about time to wrap this one up. This has been enough of me yakking about all of the possible ways you could record drums. So I hope this has been a good overview for you guys. I hope this has been useful for you and not too long-winded. I know once I start nerding about this stuff, I can nerd out pretty hard. But thank you for nerding out with me. Big favor to ask for you. If you've liked this, please comment in the comments down below. What's your ideal way to mic up a drum kit? What do you like to use? What mics would be your first choices? Give me your line item list of what mics you would use if you only had 2, if you only had 4, if you only had 8. Share them in the comments down below. If you want to tell me about it, at podcast@sonicscoop.com, email me at podcast@sonicscoop.com. If you want some more stuff with me, I got some free stuff for you. I got a free workshop called The 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers, which you can check out at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits, or my free workshop on mastering. You can find that at sonicscoop.com/mastering101. Big shout out and thank you to you for smashing the like button, for commenting, for writing with questions, all that good stuff. Also, big shout out to Soundtoys for making some of my favorite creative mixing effects. Try out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com, as well as Steinberg, makers of some of the coolest software out there, Cubase, Nuendo, Wavelab, Dorico, and also great hardware interfaces. Check them out, show them some love, tell them we sent you. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.